So let's start on time and end on time. I am Marcelo Aragão. I'm head of the International Affairs Department. Please feel very welcome and be here. This is a very interesting session with three different papers about international economics. Two of them have a fiscal skill to it, so how much the international perspective more or less condition or shape the choices that the fiscal authority might have. The third one goes more on the heterogeneity of the shocks that might condition exchange rates. The three make a very interesting congent set of information. I read all of them. I have my own questions, but I do hope you enjoy the sessions. Please, first, we'll start with Hernan. Hernan will talk about expropriation risks over the business cycle. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers and the bank for putting this nice program and for having me here. And thank all of you for attending the presentation. So this paper is showing work, and it's called Expropriation Risk over the Business Cycle. Basically, what we do is we basically start from a simple observation. Let me start this. Okay, we start from a simple observation. If you look at the data, what we find is that countries that have defaulted in the past, that we just call them defaulters, sovereign defaulters, tend to have lower and more volatile investment to output ratios, and tend to exhibit an effect that is called the sovereign debt overhang effect, right? That basically relates the level of sovereign debt to the investment level. No? Higher levels of sovereign debts seems to be associated with lower levels of investment. So we start from this observation, and we basically want to study two types of expropriation risks that may be related to this lower investment and less dynamic investment of these economies. So we focus on sovereign default risk, and we focus on taxation without commitment, right? So we're going to have a government that is subject to these two types of expropriations, and our objective is try to understand how this is going to affect or shape the business cycle in emerging economies. Okay, okay, so let me show you our data section. I mean, this is a very simple approach to the data. We just get some data from emerging economies. We classify them between defaulters and not defaulters. And we find basically that if you look at these numbers, defaulters tend to have around 20% less investment to output ratios. 20% investment to output ratios are 20% smaller in defaulter economies than non-defaulters. The investment is less dynamic. Okay, so these differences, they don't seem too large, but they are about 1 percentage point annualized per year, so it's quite a lot. And investment growth is also more volatile for defaulters. Okay, so we start with this observation. Then we look at some data for some of the economies that that have defaulted in kind of recently. So here you have data for Argentina 82, Argentina 2001, Mexico 82, Peru 84, and South Africa 85. The period 0 would indicate the period in which these economies have defaulted. So these are 2 years before, 2 years after the default. And in the vertical axis, you have the investment to output ratio. What you see is that investment to output ratios start falling on average, let's say, quite early, right? 2 years before default in most of these cases. So this, I mean, remember that this, if there's a default in period 0, most likely there was a recession before. So investment is kind of collapsing before the default. So this gives us some suggestive evidence of the relationship that can arise between investment and default and the sovereign debt overhang, because also in this period, 2 years before the default, it seems to be the case also that these economies have accumulated higher and higher increasing levels of debt. Okay, so we basically start with these two observations, and this is what we do. In this paper, we're going to develop a quantitative theory of expropriation risk in emerging economies, and we're going to do it through building a quantitative model that includes a private sector subject to financial frictions and corporate investment, and a government. A government that is going to be benevolent but cannot commit pretty much to anything. Right? Our government will issue foreign debt that will be subject to default risk, and then will collect taxes on domestic firms that will be subject to a lack of commitment. Right? So the government cannot announce a tax rate and commit to keep it constant forever. Okay? And so what we want to do here is again, we want to study the business cycle of this incentive of expropriation risk. We want to see, we're going to need a model because we want to see how expropriation risks are going to affect investment, and through investment, the business cycle. But we also want to see if investment and the business cycle itself affect this expropriation risk, and which channel in particular, and how in each channel. Okay. So time. Okay. So I will skip the very brief literature review that we have here, but in a nutshell, this is what we are going to do, and this is what we think is new for the literature. We're going to have a model with optimal debt and default decisions. We're going to have a model with taxation that is also going to be optimal. And we're going to see how these two layers of expropriation firm interact with the real side of the economy. Okay. So the rest of the presentation will be as follows. I will give you an overview of the model, then show you how the model matches the data, and then do some experiments. Okay? I will try to squeeze as many experiments as we can, but most likely I will not be able to cover all the stuff that we do. Okay? Okay, so this is an overview of the model. In the next slide, I have another overview because I don't have the model, because I cannot show you the full model. So let me just jump to the artistic part of the presentation. Okay, so here, this box is the small open economy. Okay? That is part of the world where we have international agents also, some guys that are in the rest of the world. In the domestic economy, we are going to have firms, households, and a government. Okay? So, okay, the households, this is going to be a type of sovereign default model as in Arellano, 2008, or Eaton and Gersowitz, right? It's going to be in this tradition of reputational models of sovereign default. So in these models, the households don't play a substantial role. They are quite passive agents. They are going to receive some flow of government spending, and they are going to decide consumption, but the only resource that these guys are going to have are the dividends that the firm pay. Okay, so they are going to be maximizing a trivial problem where they are going to consume all the dividends that they receive. Okay? The firms are going to, okay, let me show you first, tell you first about the government. The government is going to finance this government spending, is going to collect taxes from the firm, and is going to borrow internationally, right? At every period, the government can wake up and set the tax rate that finds optimal, given the state of the economy, and can wake up and repudiate the debt. If the government decides to repudiate the debt, it will be punished by autarky, and it will be kicked out of international asset markets for a random amount of periods. But if the government decides to repay the debt, it will have access to asset market and then can issue an amount of debt today, this B prime, that is going to be repaid in the future, and it's going to be purchased by risk-neutral lenders. Okay. In the small open economy, we are also going to have firms that are going to own a stock of capital and are going to produce using a Cobb-Douglas function, mixing this stock of capital and some intermediate imported inputs that have to be paid with a working capital constraint. Okay? In order to finance this working capital constraint, the firms are going to rely on some financial intermediaries that are in the rest of the world, that are one-period agents. I mean, these guys are super simple. These are one-period agents that have to borrow Q at the risk-free rate and will lend Q domestically to these firms at the rate R, and will basically acquire the profits coming from this spread. The trick is that we're going to have some financial frictions here in the financial intermediaries that follow the type of financial frictions of Gavin and Mascioli. Okay? These guys will have some incentive compatibility constraints to fulfill, and it's going to give rise to a non-trivial external market for borrowing. Okay? So let me. Okay. Okay. So we are. I'm in the middle of the presentation already. Kind of 10 minutes gone. So here. I have all the agents with a very detailed description. I'm not going to click in any of it. Let me just I'm not going to show you the next slide, but let me just tell you what we try to do. I told you that if the government defaults, it's going to be kicked out of international asset markets, going to be put in autarky, right? For a random amount of periods. Usually, that type of default cost is not enough to generate the dynamics of the economy that you observe in a default episode. So usually, the literature has put some direct output cost. In our case, we are not going to have this direct output cost that you default and some part of the economy breaks down. We are not going to have that. But when you default, the financial friction that these financial intermediaries face is going to become, it's going to become stronger, let's say. And so these guys are going to help us generate an endogenous default cost in the model that will mimic the type of cost that you will see in for example, in the setup of Christine Arishan in 2008, right? That are kind of some asymmetric default costs that are sort of standard in the literature. Okay? So I'm going to skip the picture. The next picture that I'm going to skip basically explains or characterizes the partial equilibrium of this loan market, right? But yes, I will not have time to explain it. I will skip it. Okay. So the numerical implementation of the model, we're going to have a production function with that's Cobb-Douglas. Z is going to be the unique aggregate TFP shock. It's going to be the unique shock in the economy. Our preferences are standard too. And we're going to have some adjustment cost in the accumulation of capital. We're going to be convex, and this is basically to help the model match the data, because otherwise we would have too lumpy and too volatile investment. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there are a bunch of parameters. We take some of those from the literature, others we calibrate, and we calibrate them basically to match these moments. Okay, so these are all target moments. You see that the model is doing quite well in the target moments. So these moments are non-targeted. Okay. So the model doesn't do that bad either. So we can get pretty much the lack of consumption smoothing that you tend to observe in emerging economies. Sorry, I didn't say this, and this is important. I calibrate this model for Argentina, right, using quarterly data for the period starting in the 80s until the default of 2001. Okay, okay. So here we kind of match the relative volatility of the trade balance. We are short in the average investment, right? So the average investment to output ratio in the data is 20%. We can produce 10% without messing around with all other moments. But qualitatively, you see the correlations and everything seems to be quite okay. We kind of generate too much procyclicality in government spending too. Those are kind of the problems that we are trying to deal in the future. Also, the model has the same issues that may arise in any other model of sovereign default, like generating not enough average spreads for the government, but this is something that we know how to solve. The things that we don't want to put more ingredients in the model. Okay, and this is how the model behaves in default. Okay. This is how the model is going to behave in default. So here we are going to show some dynamics. I'm going to skip some of them because I have nicer results and more interesting results later. But here, so you can see that in the period 0, there's a default. This is 2.5 years before the default, 2.5 years after the default. So you see that here, the productivity is the green line. Economies tend to default in bad times, okay? But you see that from productivity to output fall in default, there's quite a large gap. The reason is that our model can actually create a lot of persistence and a lot of interesting endogenous dynamics, right? So this is the behavior of basically investment on this axis with the red line, and capital. So investment tends to fall, and if you see it seems that the investment is starting to fall 1.5 years before default, as we saw in the data, and capital falls and has this very persistent negative effect on the economy. Okay, okay, so let me. Okay, so this is the behavior of intermediate inputs during default. So you see that intermediate inputs fall during default, and this is the interest rate that these firms are paying in order to finance the working capital. That explains a big part of the endogenous output loss, right? Okay, so now let me just, I have like 5 minutes to go. There are two exercises that we find interesting that I think I will be able to tell you about. So in our model, we are going to have these 2 dimensions of timing consistency. Okay, one is going to be optimal profit tax, right? That is not without commitment, and sovereign default. So what we are going to do is we are going to do 2 counterfactuals. We are going first to do one counterfactual in which we fix the tax rate, right? And we assume that the government can actually commit and will commit to that tax rate. And then we're going to have a second counterfactual where we're going to put direct utility costs of default that are going to be too large, such that the economy does not actually want to default too often. Okay, okay, so here is the tax margin. Here we have some moments, the baseline economy, and the economy with fixed taxes. So this is something interesting that we found. I was not expecting this by any means. When you fix the tax rate, so you assume that the government has to commit to a fixed tax. Then we also, I mean, this is something endogenous that we didn't expect. We are also killing the default rate. The default incentive also disappears almost for the government. Okay, so this is 1.9 default probability annual. So it moves to 0.4% is default probability annual. This happens in a context in which, on average, the government debt also decreases. Okay? There's also a drop in average MB and in the cyclicality of the spread. So what we think that is going on here is the following. You are taking away the possibility for the government to play around with taxes when the economy is in default. So the default outcome, the incentives to default also decrease, because the government cannot affect the value of autarky by decreasing taxes and making the firms accumulate more capital once you are in default. So in that case, the value of autarky goes down, and then the government does not want to actually default that much when they don't have the possibility of playing around with taxes. So you can see also what happens in terms of investment, right? So when we have fixed taxes, investment goes up, right? Investment to operation increase. The volatility of investment also goes down. So the expropriation risk through taxation plays a big role in shaping the business cycle that we observe in the first slide, or the reason why economies that are subject to default risk tend to accumulate less capital. Okay, so this is something that we find interesting. So let me. Okay, when you get rid of the utility costs, so when you put the utility cost to remove the inflation, sorry, the default rate, we see that taxes become higher on average and more counter-cyclical. So the government, in the case of missing the default opportunity, will exploit more the expropriation to the private sector through taxes. That's basically what we find. Okay, so let me skip this. Let me show you this. So we have a model, right? And we can dissect the model in the way we want. So I could show you here the correlation between government debt and investment, and it would be negative, as we observe in the sovereign debt overhang. But I can do something better. I can take the policy functions of investment, and I can plot them, the policy function of investment, as a function of debt. You see that as debt starts increasing, as it increases, investment goes down. So we are actually getting the sovereign debt overhang here. So we have low capital and high capital and different levels of TFP. This is all the same. How does this is me. Sorry. So how does the sovereign debt overhang play in this model? Well, it plays through this equation. See. This equation is the optimality condition of the firm with respect to capital. This is the cost of increasing the stock of capital in one unit. This is the benefit, the expected benefit given from future profits. So the tax rate of the economy, and through the tax rate, the government debt affects investment, appears here, affecting the expected profits, and here, because the working capital constraint depends on this term. So higher taxes are going to decrease the expected return of investing in capital. Are going to decrease it, and this is the stochastic discount factor. Higher taxes are going to increase the stochastic discount factor, right? So we have the two channels going in opposite direction. Higher taxes decrease the bracket, but increase M. As an outcome, we get this red line. If we were to work with constant discount factor, then with constant discounting, we would have this line. But if you see the axis, this axis is for constant discounting. Most of the action is actually coming from the discount factor. The discount factor is playing a big role in the observed dynamics that we can capture with the model. So I'm going to stop here. There's a couple of nice results also in the paper if you want to check that I was not going to cover. But, thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Nice. Rodrigo, please.
Okay, I'm going to find my presentation. Okay, I'm Rodrigo Caputo from the Universidad de Santiago in Chile, and I want to thank the organizers for including my paper and also giving me the opportunity to comment this very interesting contribution. This is a paper perhaps I guess it's quite relevant for the region in the sense that we always face, or foreign investors may face expropriation risk. So I guess this is a welcome contribution to understand this. And I'm going to organize my comments in two sets of comments, which are going to be as follows. Two comments are going to be related to the actual version of the paper, which is, I hope they will contribute to the final version, perhaps. And I have other two comments that are a bit I wouldn't say orthogonal to the paper, but are the type of ingredients that I would like to see in this type of papers, especially when you talk about expropriation. So perhaps it's an alternative way of addressing this issue. So, okay, so this paper offers a framework to assess two expropriatory mechanisms in emerging economies. So the choice of sovereign default actually impacts, by the government, impacts both foreign investors, who by definition do not vote and do not enter in the welfare utility of the society, so to speak, but will also impact, I will show this in a bit, will also impact domestic investors, domestic firms and domestic households. And the other mechanism is the design of profit taxes under no commitment that actually imply a confiscation to firms' profits. Okay? And both channels have a direct and negative impact on expected returns on, of domestic firms. Okay? So taxation, well, this is here. Okay, taxation is going to affect directly the returns of the firms. So the more you tax a firm, the less incentives the firm has to invest. And an important and another feature, perhaps, is that once you default, you increase the cost for the domestic firms of working capital. So R is going to increase, and this is going to generate also a decline in profits and also a decline in investment. So I guess this is the main channel through which both expropriatory mechanisms works in the model. And I would like to discuss some of the results and perhaps some of the alternative exercises that can perhaps generate a larger effect of fixing taxes or avoiding these expropriatory mechanisms. Okay, so as Hernán was mentioning, a flat tax prevents time inconsistent behavior. So the tax is going to be 15%. So it's going to be fixed, as opposed as the case in which the government actually set a tax which has a mean of 15% and standard deviation of 3.9, and also a correlation which is negative with output. And the result is that once you fix the tax, so once you commit to a fixed tax, then investment to output ratio increases from 10% to 11%. There is a decline also in the default probability, a decline in the envy, and so on. Okay. So my first substantial suggestion, I would say, is that to do an alternative tax exercise. Okay. So when the economy, or when the tax is fixed, that eliminates time inconsistency, which is okay. Okay. So fixing tau to the benchmark 15% eliminates time inconsistency, but it also eliminates scenarios in which the government may want to reduce taxes. Okay. So the tax policy in the model is a function of many variables, state variables, but it's also a function of the actual GDP. So in that sense, when you fix the tax, you somehow kill some mechanism that actually goes in the opposite direction, in the sense that it will increase investment. Okay. So as the benchmark suggests, a negative correlation of taxes to output, fixing the tax will be okay once you are in bad times. So in bad times, fixing the tax rate will mean that the government cannot increase taxes as a way of collecting more resources. But in good times, this works in the opposite direction. Okay? So in good times, fixing tau to 15% could be above the level the government would have chosen if it can choose freely. So I would say, and this is the artistic part of my comments, is you have a tax policy function, and here, well, I don't have the microphone, but in this part, in this region, output is below an average. So this is the BAF or the recession part of the economy. So in this case, and this is why it's in green, the commitment device, which is fixing taxes, actually implies that you have less taxes than the taxes that the government will have chosen. So that's fine. So this is the mechanism that I guess in the model explains why investment increases. But once you are in good times, and remember there is a negative correlation between taxes and output, so once you are in a good times, maybe the government will have chosen a different tax level below the 15%. So in this case, and this is why it's in red, you prevent the government from reducing taxes, and this somehow hurts the economy or hurts the investors. Okay? So what is my suggestion? Is to set a policy rules, so to speak, in which taxes are going to be the minimum between 15% and the Tau policy function, Tau, which is actually depending on some state variables. So once the economy is in good times, the government will choose a tax which is below 15. When the economy is in bad times, then the government will choose actually a tax which is below the tax that the government will have chosen freely. So this more flexible commitment device, my conjecture is that will imply a higher investment to output ratio, because I mean you somehow benefit from lower taxes in good times. Okay. My second comment is related to welfare implications. It would be nice to see what are the welfare gains of alternative taxation schemes in each scenario. And actually, if you compute the welfare, or if you do a welfare analysis, then you can generalize this tax policy function, for instance, tau star, which is the minimum between tau, which is the optimal ceiling for taxes. By optimal, I mean the level of ceiling that actually maximizes welfare. So once you have that welfare function, then you can derive this optimal ceiling. And so it's going to be the minimum between the optimal ceiling and the tau policy function. Okay, so as I was mentioning, the tau optimal maximizes welfare. So those are my more substantial comments, I guess. The more orthogonal comments to the paper are the following. I don't have it in the slides, but you can actually think expropriation. You can think in the context of a country that produces a commodity that generates recurring rents. For instance, Chile's copper. Latin America is plenty of that. And then you have the expropriation risk, truly. I mean, in the 70s, Chile actually nationalized copper, the industry. In Argentina, as far as I understand, there is some expropriation to exporters through taxes as well. Evo Morales, some time ago, actually tried to also expropriate some foreign firms. So this is, I guess, if you introduce a commodity sector that has a decrease in return to scale, you generate the rents that you already have, and you can keep a non-commodity sector that has constant return to scale, and in that sector you can put like taxes to capital or taxes to rents, and then you can link this taxation to a very nice paper of Goober and others, which is called use it or lose it, taxing capital or taxing capital returns, so which is a big question. So then you will have like really the expropriation risk in the sense that you can think of the tax to the commodity sector as a royalty that if it's set too high, then actually will prevent perhaps investment or will mean really an expropriation of the recurring rents. So, but overall, very nice paper, and thanks for the opportunity to reading it.
Thanks, Rodrigo. And before you react, just take the privilege of sitting here, and because my question was much more in line, I think would benefit of applying both. Rodrigo mentioned something about commitment and having in good times a different set. When I read the paper, I was left with a provocative, I tried to draw lessons, policy recommendations out of your results, which are very interesting in terms of that. What I understood is there is underlying a problem of consumption smoothing and the intemporal changing in that. This is very well described on the paper. And there is not enough smoothing, and the government has the adverse incentives to be more pro-cyclical in terms of taxation and compensate the downturn in terms of a counter-cyclical spending. My alternative suggestion was to explore not only commitment in terms of level, which is quite hard in a sense to anticipate, but commitment in terms of behavior. So I promise to be, in a sense, do my counter-cyclical job during downturn, but when the time will have a boom, I would revert my behavior. So I would, in a sense, contribute, do my part to the private sector is moving consumption, and perhaps this will induce ex-ante behavior that reduces the pain points that you point. There's a lack of investment and volatility in investment. So yeah, it's more or less that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for reading the paper. When you write a paper and you actually think that nobody will read it, but this is a very, very nice surprise. Okay, so one thing about I was in the Fed last week and I got a similar comment about the taxes, about the tax exercise, that is kind of too extreme, and that's true. There's something that I think it's interesting in this model. When the government is accumulating debt and is approaching to the default region, the government plays with taxes in a little bit of a counterintuitive way. The government tries to distribute let's say the cost of accumulating debt in the two wedges that it has. So when the government accumulates debt, and on one side it is starting to suffer the default probability, right, and the higher spread. But the government doesn't want to put all the eggs in that basket. So it will start to increase taxes in order to avoid skyrocketing the level of debt. So it's trying to, before the default, it's trying to distribute the cost of the accumulation of debt in the two layers of expropriation. So there's a sort of a complementarity that we find, and that's interesting. And when the economy defaults, all of a sudden the government reduces taxes to incentivize firms to undo the financial friction and incentivize firms to accumulate capital. So we found that is quite interesting because it's sort of in line with the data. I mean, broadly speaking, it's not that the countries increase the level of taxes before the default, but they tend to put more taxes, right? And after, when the government is in default, it's not that the countries tend to reduce the level of taxes, but tend to put more cross subsidies and such. We capture this with this very small thing. About the welfare gains, that's we didn't do, but that's something we need to explore more. And we have to think about the commodity sector. That can change the model. I mean, can give rise to a new very interesting paper to analyze. Yeah. And your comment, I think, it goes in line to think about introducing a fiscal rule, explicit fiscal rule, for one part of for the recession or the expansion. Yeah, and that can be a way to put it simply in the model and take that into account. We'll do it. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. Well, let's open for questions. We do have 8 minutes, so there's plenty of time. Anybody wants to jump in? Please. Yeah.
So, question is a bit off topic, not off topic.
It's just, please, it's just because it's going to be broadcast and, yeah.
My question is, so focuses on the debt overhang side of things. And I'm wondering whether you can generate the same kind of links in between investment and debt by, even without default, because so far you're making this, basically the spread of the Gabe Maggiore guys the spread that they charge, which is quite important in the endogenous mechanism, a function of default. But what if that wedge is a function of the debt level? Would you get the same sort of dynamics? You still have the tax incentive to basically play with how that debt level evolves over time. So I think the kind of the interplay between taxes and debt still would hold, and you probably get the same sort of debt overhang type dynamics without the actual default materializing or even the possibility of default. Just a thought.
Okay, so we do that exercise in the paper. We have the same decomposition that we do with the moments in the data. We do it with the policy functions of investment. So we have the base economy where we have the sovereign debt overhang, and where the two channels, the stochastic discount factor and expected returns, they interact and give rise to the sovereign debt overhang. And then we have an exercise where we keep taxes constant, and an exercise where we remove the default probability and see how things change. What we find is that in both of these cases, the role of the stochastic discount factor that goes in the opposite direction tends to be more important. So if we fix both, if we get rid of the default probability of the default option, we find that for a big region of the debt, the sovereign debt overhang disappears, and it only appears when the debt is too large. But you are right that there's some part of the state space where it still happens.
Thanks.
We do have time for more questions. Yes, please. Do you want to? Does anybody? That's okay. So just let's
Thank you.
round of applause for Hernan, and I invite you all to read the papers. Rodrigo, please. Floor is yours.
Well, thanks again. So this paper is called Escape Clauses for Escaping Default. It's a joint work with Felix Ordóñez from Universidad de Santiago. He's leaving, in a few months for doing a PhD. And the main idea of this paper is trying to assess to what extent escape clauses in debt limit rules, so rules that actually set a limit to the fiscal debt, can actually prevent default scenarios, which is maybe a bit, it may appear a bit counterintuitive. So we will try to address this question, and in which scenarios an escape clause, which actually eliminates the debt limit that it has been imposed to the fiscal authority, to what extent this escape clause actually can be something that may be welfare improving. Okay. So motivation, fiscal rules are widely used in the world. As 2020, it has been adopted, or they have been adopted by more than 100 countries. Debt limit rules are the more frequent ones, and they set a limit generally in terms to the debt, to the fiscal debt, or to GDP, so an explicit number. Although debt rules are not meant to be rigid, so many of the debt rules that are in place actually consider or introduce explicitly escape clauses for specific reasons and in specific scenarios. But you can deviate from the rule, or you can abandon the rule in very specific cases. And how frequently? Well, not. Okay, so. Okay, so here you have the number of countries with fiscal rules. It has increased, or the number of countries have increased substantially. The blue bars represent debt rules. Okay, so countries that may have debt rules, they may have debt rules combined with, I don't know, with balance deficit rules as well, and so on. And you can see that, but the debt rules are the more prevalent ones around the world. Okay, and here in this graph you have we present the number of countries that introduce explicitly escape clauses. So escape clauses have been introduced systematically over time, even before the pandemic, and they have, and this is the orange bars, and the green bars represent the episodes or the number of countries that actually activated those escape clauses. So in the pandemic, as you might have expected, most of the countries with escape clauses actually activated them. Okay, so this is, so escape clauses actually exist and have been used, well, very recently at least. Okay. So just to motivate why this may be an important issue for emerging economies and why this is perhaps some of the elements that have entered into the discussion. Here are some numbers for the Chilean economy. Okay, so the Chilean economy, since the 90s, have had low levels of debt to GDP that began to skyrocket after the end of the commodity boom, so to speak. And even before the pandemic, the debt to GDP was increasing very substantially. Okay, so there was a bit of a concern in the Chilean economy and among policymakers and also academics about the level of of debt. Okay, so many people have argued that this level of debt may put the economy in a fiscal position or a fragile fiscal position. Okay, so there were some concerns in Chile during the pandemic about the level of debt. Okay, so the level of debt was already high, and many people Chileans, actually, many economists and policymakers were actually very concerned about the increasing the debt in the economy. Okay, Calvo, however, had a very different view in a 2020 interview. He said that, well, Chile can borrow more, reputation, sovereign funds give fiscal space, and this is this comment was a bit against the majority of opinions in Chile, more debt and more deficit needed to face national emergency. So although Chile didn't have an explicit debt limit, it seems that he was not suggesting, but saying, well, in a national emergency, you may use, or you may have a larger deficit and also accumulate a bit of more debt. Okay, so what is the question in this paper? Well, to what extent escape clauses into debt limit rules can actually affect the probability of default, the sovereign spread, social welfare, and what are the benefits, if any, of escape clauses outside the activation zone or the event zone? So you activate the escape clauses in a very specific scenario, and we want to see to what extent, when you are far away from that adverse scenario, if the escape clauses have like a latent impact on the economy. Okay. So what do? We address this question in the context of a sovereign default model, as the one Hernan have just presented. This is a long tradition since Eaton and Gersowitz, 1981, Arellano, 2008, more recently Hachondo et al., 2022, and Lopez Martin, Leal, and Martinez Fischer in 2019. Okay? We consider, as in the case of Hernan, small open economy. Government has two sources of income, so the government taxes GDP, and it also taxes, and we have commodity exports. We don't have a sector explicitly in the sense that we just have commodity revenues, but the government has some share on that commodity revenues, on those commodity revenues. So the government gets income from taxes and from commodity revenues, and we allow escape clauses in adverse cycles, so we call debt rules with an escape clause. Okay. And a preview of the results, in recessions, governments face a trade-off between expanding government transfers. So the government, as Hernan was pointed out, is actually doing the smoothing for households. So households are very static, so to speak. They consume all disposable income, so they cannot borrow. And the government somehow borrow on their behalf in the international markets and actually transfer resources in bad times or taxes them more in good times. Okay? So in recessions, government face the following trade-off. In recession, consumption is more valued, so government transfers are more valued by households, but at the same time, you have to repay debt, which is actually more expensive. So what to do? One alternative is to default, and the other one, and you will default if your debt limit is very close to the debt that you are facing at that time. Okay, so the intuition is that the debt limit may actually exacerbate this trade-off, which is the same result from a different angle, is that escape clauses actually mitigate this trade-off in bad times. So escape clauses reduce both the probability of default and also the sovereign spread. Benefits of these escape clauses are present even when they are not active. And I have to point out here some of the comments we have received from referees. We are thinking of debt rules as rules that are actually that do not generate a welfare. So are not rules that are actually imposing some discipline on the fiscal authority. So we are thinking about a very disciplined economy, like Germany, that is actually in a monetary union with countries that have a lower debt tolerance, and Germany has to have a debt limit that may be binding or not, but is not the debt limit that Germany as a whole will have. So that's something I have to clarify since the beginning. An alternative exercise is to see to what extent debt limit rules are actually an efficient way of imposing discipline into the economy. Okay, but we don't have done this yet. Okay. Okay, so the model is the same one as, well, a very similar one to the one presented by Hernan. So households actually, or the utility of households depends on consumption, on leisure, which is the negative of working hours, and on government transfers. They cannot borrow, households, and they have to pay taxes. Consume all disposable income, and they receive a fraction of the total production, which is actually a production that depends only on labor. Okay, so this is one slide. It's a very simple setup for households. Okay, so the government has a more dynamic problem. It faces a dynamic problem. It collects taxes from households, tau over y, receive income from commodity exports, chi, and where the government or the revenues to the government actually depend on the driving forces in the economy, which are TFP shocks and commodity price shocks. Okay, this is a crucial part. The government can The government can issue new debt, okay, at a price Q. Okay, this price is going to be in this type of model endogenous to the economy and to the decisions of the fiscal authority, and also to the realization of shocks. And the government also pays debt. Okay, and okay, let me stay here for a bit. And in this part, the government may also choose not to pay debt. So B is going to be zero. It doesn't pay debt. If this is the case, the government will not be able also to issue new debt. Okay, so this is the way in which default is actually introduced in this type of models. Okay, so once you default in your current debt, you cannot issue new debt. Okay, so here is the budget constraints for the government. A key factor or a key element is that the price of the debt is actually a function of many variables, but it's actually a function of the level of debt and the realizations of shocks. So if this price declines, it means that the government is facing a higher cost or higher future cost of repaying debt. So it's the opposite of, or it means, or it's equivalent to an increase in the interest rate. And okay, so the government actually has the following value function of the government. So the government decides actually to continue in the financial markets by not defaulting. So VC is the continuation value of not defaulting, or it can choose to default. So VD is the continuation value of defaulting, and in that case, B is going to be zero, and B prime is also going to be zero. So it has to choose among the two. Of course, I mean, whether it defaults or not, it depends on the gains that the government will face. Okay. So this is the value function on the repayment. So the government actually, the continuation value, or it depends on the new debt that it has issued and on the future path of shocks, subject to the consumption of households and the working hours of households, which are as I say, very static. And if under no default, this is going to be the budget constraint of the government. So it has income from taxing households, from issuing new debt, and from commodity revenues. Okay, and it has to pay the debt it has issued before. What we do, we introduce a fiscal or debt limit explicitly. So B hat is going to be the debt limit, which is, I don't know, a number, well, we calibrated this to the Chilean economy. So whenever B prime is above this limit, then the government cannot choose B prime. So it has to choose any value below the limit. It has some restrictions, okay? Under default, okay, under default, B is 0, B prime is also 0, and there is an exogenous probability of re-entering the financial markets, mu, and y minus mu is the probability that the government continues on default. And in this case, the government gets some revenues, tau times yd, where yd is the output and the default, which is one of the elements that Hernan introduced in his paper at the end, is once you are in default, you experience a loss in GDP. Okay? So let me skip this part, but mostly is the endogenous premium, or the endogenous price of debt, which depends on D, which is a function that is equal to 1 once the government defaults. So if you default, Q is 0, which means that the interest rate is infinity. So the price of debt depends on the expectations that foreign agents have about the defaulting behavior of government. So if agents expect the government to default more often, then the price of debt is going to decline, or the spread is going to increase. Okay, okay, so we have the standard default model, and we incorporate a escape clause, which is a very simple one. So we can identify, or we assume that the government and foreign agents can identify the cycle. Okay, so when productivity shocks are below the median, or copper income shocks are also below the median, we call this an adverse scenario. Okay, thanks. A positive one is when both are above the median, and the other ones are intermediate scenarios. So the escape clause, and since I don't have too much time, I'm going to skip some of my slides, but the escape clause is going to be activated only under this very specific case, once the economy is in a bad situation. Okay? We calibrate the model to using standard models from the literature. So those are the coefficients from other papers. We calibrate the process for the Chilean economy, for the shocks that hit the Chilean economy, and then we calibrate. We use some coefficients to calibrate some moments relevant for the Chilean economy. So average debt to GDP, the MB, which is the average spread, and also the correlation between spreads and GDP. Okay, so the model, by definition, is targeting well the targeted moments. Okay, we do a welfare analysis. Okay, so let me just jump to the results. So here we present the relative loss of having a debt rule. So when your debt is low, then you have the debt rule actually performs worse than the unrestricted case, but then the performance is much more worse once you are approaching the debt limit, okay? Once you allow an escape clause, then in this part, in this region, in which the government will have defaulted eventually because it cannot increase debt, and it has to decide whether to pay or transfer resources to households, and in this case, it transfers resources to households, so it defaults more often. This part actually of this trade-off is actually reduced, and in this case, escape clauses are actually performing better. So this is not, I mean, the difference is perhaps not so surprising. What is surprising is that even for low levels of debt or even assets, then even in that case, escape clauses seem to provide a better a better performance of the economy. So escape clauses are actually beneficial, so to speak, even when they are not activated. And escape clauses also show or appear in the price of debt. Okay, so the price of debt or the interest rate is going to be very high once you have a debt limit, and it's going to be very high precisely once you approach a debt limit. And this is not going to be the case, or not as strong as in the debt limit rules, once you have escape clauses. So once you have escape clauses, the price is not going to decline too much, which means that the interest rate is not going to increase too much either. Okay. So just quickly, I have just 2 minutes. So okay, so in the unrestricted scenario, then in an unrestricted case, in an adverse scenario, you have 42% of debt to GDP. And if we set a limit of 38% of debt to GDP as the limit, then we see that in the adverse scenario, unrestricted, you will borrow more, and the default rate is going to be also low. If you have a debt rule, then in the adverse scenario, you cannot borrow more than 38. So the average debt to GDP is going to be 36, and the default rate is going to be higher. But if you allow an escape clause to be present only in the adverse scenario, then in the adverse scenario, you're going to have more debt, you can access more debt, and the default probability is going to be below the case in which you only have debt limit rule. And what is the mechanism, or the precise mechanism behind this result? Okay, so in the adverse scenario, okay, in adverse scenario, lower GDP, lower consumption, and declining revenue. So that's the way in which we can characterize the economy in this scenario. So transfers are more valued by households, but the price of debt increase. Dilemma, pay debt or increase transfers. So we can see here that the government transfers are actually 15 in the debt rules, and are actually below the transfers that the government will have give unrestrictedly. And also the spread is going to be high here under that rule. But if you remove only in the adverse scenario the rule, then you can actually transfer more resources, you can increase the debt level, and because you're going to default less, the spread is going to react endogenously to a lower level. Okay, so I think I don't have much time. Only to say that in simulations, the model, once we simulate it, it looks like this. So the blue one is the unrestricted scenario. The green one is the scenario in which you have an escape clause, which is actually very close to the blue one in the activation zone once you have an activation or an activated rule. And the red one is always below the 2. Okay? So I don't have too more time, so I will jump to the conclusions. Escape clause mitigate the trade-off between expanding government transfer and repaying debt. In adverse cycles, the government can issue more debt to sustain transfers and debt repayments at the same time. Escape clauses reduce both the probability of default and the sovereign spread. And the benefits of those clauses are present even when they are not active. Okay, thanks.
Ron, please.
First of all, thanks the seminar to invite me to make these comments. This paper, it's very interesting paper. It's a very relevant paper that it deals with a real problem and with real world, and also the economists have been applying those fiscal rules in the last decades, even before the pandemic times. And also it incorporates some interaction and corporate economic them and between escape clause, sovereign default, sovereign spread, economic cycle, and social welfare. In my comments, I will say some. It's gonna be better here. I will say I will make some overview of the paper. and then you make some suggestions to improve the paper. But I would say like here it's easy to say these suggestions to not put the model in my hand. The paper focused on debt limit rules. They not focus in sovereign spread break rules, but they include the sovereign spread endogenously. And the paper neither deal with fiscal deficit rules with some percent of the GDP. But the debt limit rules that the paper deals, they can deal with the sovereign spread break. So they have some general assumptions. The government and the households have the same discount factor. They use a small open economy with 3 agents. Households, the governments, international lenders, and the government maximizes the welfare of the households. They have access to international financial markets and determining the level of public spending. And the tax rate is given. The government budget constraint can be expressed as this equation. As the tax rate is given, we can think that in recession times, the revenues from recession will be lower than in positive scenarios. In the paper, you have mentioned that there are like another papers in the literature that allow the tax rate to be flexible. But I would like to see if you put this tax rate as flexible, because before the COVID times, what we see is that in recession times, the government, usually it's difficult for the government to do that, but usually they raise taxes to be in the fiscal rule. But you know that in the COVID times, it was almost impossible to do that. That's why I think that we saw a lot of escape clauses being activated in these times. The value function, it follows this one, as we have seen right now, with a government budget constraint and with this escape closure. In case of default, the government budget constraint will be the revenue from the GDP from the recession plus the commodity revenue. You have 3 possible scenarios. The adverse, the positive, the intermediate one. In the international lens, can observe productivity, commodity price, and the level of foreign assets. That's why that they can put endogenously the sovereign spread when they borrow to the government. And the model is also calibrated to challenge economy and consider the particulars, of course, of the country, including the relevance of the copper, of the commodity sector overall. But this is, I put some calibration targets for the model, but this is something that of my interest if you put another kind of calibration, because Chile from Latin America is, it's a country that another country should follow in terms of debt level and another variables. And here, for example, we have like 38.5%. My question here, and I put it as, is this kind of course you don't know because you calibrate for the Chilean model, but if you use like an economy like Brazil, for example, they have like 75%, 80% of that level, and other variables that are not so beautiful like Chile model. Here you see that the probability of default in your model, then all of our probability of default here in fiscal rule with escape clauses is lower than debt rule, enhancing your result that putting escape clauses are make it better for in terms of welfare, and also the spread. And I have some suggestions also that I don't know how to put it in the analysis, but like in terms of monetary policy, the credibility, the reputation is very important in the analysis. And you also in your presentation here said that Calvo that Chile has good reputation, so that they can issue a lot of bonds and debts. There is no problem. And I don't know how to do it, but to try to do an exercise with a government that is not committed to following a fiscal rule. When you're dealing with emerging countries, you know that we deal with governments that they have, they are not committed to follow fiscal rule, particularly in election years or in some another kind of year. Or even if they put some escape clauses, they are not using to follow the escape clause. For example, they can put, I have this kind of escape clause if something happens in the economy, but they can change these escape clauses every time. You have seen this in the Latin American history. And another suggestion is to try a different debt limit per country, like put a higher level, like 90 and 100%. And another one is to put like fiscal rules incorporating primary deficits. We are in a world that you have like we are dealing with. We are facing with higher interest rates. There is like not a phrase like higher for longer, and this debt can be more expensive. And so we don't know, for example, here, not only in Brazil, but in other countries, they face this kind of fiscal rule, like separating the fiscal, the primary deficit with the nominal deficit. I know that your model do not deal with this kind of complexity, but I think that to make suggestions is a kind of easy thing, you know. But I think you reach your analysis, particularly to put some kind of reputation in the government. Because you know that if a government doesn't have a reputation, if they put a fiscal rule and the investors saw like can see that the fiscal rule said no, they will not be committed to the fiscal rule, so I will not follow this. Thank you.
Diego, do you wish to?
Okay. Thanks Joao for the comments. They're very useful. And all well taken. So the flexible tax rate, yes, it's something that we didn't do on purpose. Just to isolate the mechanism through which the escape clause will work. But eventually, yeah, it will be very, very interesting, as in the Hernan's paper, to see what happens if you allow the tax to be another control for the fiscal authority. But this is perhaps, yeah, we have this on the to-do list. So we have now the to-do list. So to calibrate to other countries, yeah, I mean, the model can be calibrated to other countries as well. But the model, I mean, once you calibrate the model, you calibrate several variables at the same time. So spread, debt to GDP, and probability of default. So, and also taxation over GDP. So for Brazil, it's my guess that we have a higher spread, higher debt, perhaps higher tax collection or tax revenues over GDP. So eventually, if you have a country like Brazil into the model with higher debt, it will imply higher spread, which is actually, it is actually something that you see on the data. I don't know the level of spread of Brazil, but I know that it's higher than Chile. I don't know by how much. So the model will capture that. So at the same, put it another way, if we put the debt level of Brazil into the model, into the Chilean economy, we have a spread that is not the Chilean one, but perhaps we have the one which is relevant for Brazil. But, okay, the short answer is that yes, we can do that. It will be interesting. The level of debt or the debt limit also depends on the tax revenues to GDP and on one element that is not present in the paper, which is the nature of debt. So you have long-term debt, perhaps you can sustain higher debt to GDP. We don't have it here so far. Credibility, yeah, a key issue. So this is very important. In the model, the unrestricted part is full credibility. So that's why I was talking about Germany. So Germany has, perhaps, in my view, I don't know, more credibility than many Southern European countries. So if you impose the debt limits of the Southern European countries to Germany, perhaps it can be like a bit welfare decreasing. This is the type of things that our model is capturing. The other thing is that if you want to model a South American country in which, or that lacks credibility, then we have to reframe a bit the model. And I fully agree with you, and the referees also agree with you, that you have to generate a way in which debt rules are actually welfare improving. And one way of doing this is that the government is more myopic than it should be. So in that case, a disciplinary device or a fiscal disciplinary device, it will be the limit. So the limit will have actually some benefits that in our case it doesn't have. But our conjecture, and I hope it is true, is that even in that case, there will be some trade-offs that the escape clauses may attenuate. We're not sure. We have to do the exercise, but yeah, I fully agree with your comments.
Okay, thank you, Rodrigo. Let's open to questions, please. Oh, I know that. Yes.
Is a question? Is a question more on the empirical side? Do you have empirical evidence that escape clauses reduces or increasing spreads in some countries, like in Germany? Does it has some empirical evidence that is negative in Latin America countries, some evidence that is positive, or has no evidence that escape clause has an effect?
Okay, we don't have hard evidence, or at least I haven't read it, but escape clauses are a bit controversial for the reasons you was mentioning, that you may want to embrace escape clauses in good times, but for different reasons. So I think I have read something on this. Blanchard, I think, was discussing in IMF paper that escape clauses activated during the pandemic is okay, but then going back to normal, it may be difficult. So I guess, at least to me, an open question is to what extent escape clauses are relevant. I guess they have a bit of a bad press in the policy arena, but yeah, I don't have the hard evidence. But it will be very interesting to have it.
Any other questions? Well, I know that, among central bankers, we are trained not to talk about fiscal, but more or less academic, please. Well, I do have mine. So
Okay,
backup ones. So one is a kind of a provocation, and the other one is, in a sense, more in terms of future work. My understanding of reading the paper about escape clauses is that most of the time for the countries that do not have explicit escape clauses, when they are facing, and this will become even more true after the pandemic, when the push comes to shove, the fiscal side will react in terms of crisis. So even if you don't have an explicit one, you might violate or ask permission from the parliament to do so, and do whatever it takes. And we have seen this. So now that we know this behavior and anticipate this behavior ex ante, if, in a sense, what the other real economy agents do is to anticipate that the binding is more or less limited to a certain discontinuity in terms of the size of the shock, and they internalize this ex ante and on the behavior. So perhaps the idea of having explicit escape clause, what we're doing is not sorting the fiscal problem, but becoming, what you measure in terms of welfare is the benefit of transparency. So being explicit about how you trigger and how much you can go with the escape clauses. So I think it doesn't make your results, change your results, but it perhaps make the narrative more, in a sense, prone to the other set of countries who are less German-like.
Yeah.
So it's like your views on that.
Yeah. Okay. You're quite right in the sense that perhaps you may not have a escape clause, but you still default. The model has this ingredient that even the unrestricted model,
if you push the economy towards a very bad scenario, then you will default, whether you have a escape clause or not. But so I guess is a case of many countries that that choose, that face the bad scenarios and they default because of that. What the model doesn't have is a very interesting point that you mentioned, is that once you have like an opportunistic defaulting, which is not related to the cycle, or to the business cycle of your economy. So a political cycle or an election cycle, and that the model doesn't capture, and perhaps, yes, it's a limitation. And yes, the model, the setup in the model is that the government is credible, you can observe bad times, and you will act, or you will escape, only on bad times. So there are many ifs that, so it will be very interesting to see to what extent credibility issues may be incorporated here.
Yeah. The other question is, well, since your model is very rich in terms of capturing the welfare benefits, perhaps we should try to understand, explore its ability to see what happens afterwards. So after the escape clause is triggered, at the end of the day, the debt level will rise. And people know this. And then again, Ricardian behavior in anticipation will probably face a different regime with a different monetary or taxing levels and so on. And would that, in a sense, compromise the whole idea, or the welfare that you measure without, in a sense, foreseeing what's going to happen after this, the shock of the trigger, if would change, in a sense, the benefits of the escape clause?
Yeah,
dilute it.
Yeah, no, in this setup, you actually expect at some point to have better times. And then the escape clause does not generate any endogenous opportunistic behavior from the side of the government. But yeah, I mean, in real life, if you escape for the wrong reasons, maybe you will have to repay in the future, will mean, as you were pointed out, I guess, higher taxes. So yes, that's again some feature of the real life that are not captured in the model as it is.
We are facing a very humanitarian economic tragedy
exactly.
now, yes,
Yeah.
and we do have to take measures. But
Yeah, exactly.
this will have consequences afterward. So since your model is really nice to capture these welfare gains, it perhaps could be extended a period ahead and see the trade-offs that you're facing. It's not that you're not going to act or not going to trigger the escape clauses, but what the future brings afterwards.
Okay. Okay, yeah, good. No, I think the model, if you allow the taxes to be flexible, maybe after escaping clauses, then you have to pay it somehow, or you have to increase taxes, I guess.
Yeah.
That's my conjecture.
Okay. Nice. Any other question? So, let's round of applause to Rodrigo. João, please, the floor is yours. Last paper of the session.
So it's a paper about exchange rate pass-through. Okay. In this paper, you investigate the role of the source of the economic shocks, and I will try to identify some channels as well. When you look to the literature about exchange rate pass-through, you can explore. It's possible to explore a lot of methodologies and ways that the pass-through can happen. But more recently, a new kind of investigation pass-through, trying to identification its source, happens. So you have an investigation of this exchange rate pass-through, analyzing the origin of the economic shock and how relevant is to determine the magnitude of the exchange rate pass-through. You use the GVAR methodology, it's a global VAR, to analyze the exchange rate pass-through under shocks identified through its source. And different shocks and identification strategies are used to analyze the magnitude of the exchange rate pass-through for 5 Latin countries. So, as I said, that the literature has have explored the exchange rate pass-through in terms of volatility of inflation. So countries that the inflation has a higher volatility, usually they have a higher pass-through, as well as a level of inflation, and the importance of low and stable inflation scenario to reduce the inflation pass-through. And more recently, we have seen the importance, more relevant, is to have anchored inflation expectations to put the magnitude of the inflation pass-through in lower levels. And also the business cycle position is important because since when economy is it's growing fast, it have more space to pass these exchange rate pressures to the price, to the domestic price. And now there has been a growing interest in the literature regarding shock-dependent exchange rate pass-through. Since 2018, 2017, they have been investigating how the source of the shock that hits an economy and that hits the exchange rate of the domestic exchange rate of this economy can affect the domestic price. And this kind of investigation are important because it brings information about the reactions of macroeconomic variables. So if you identify the shock that are hitting an economy, we can identify how the macroeconomic variables will react. Usually, those papers they use individual country models, or they use big aggregated models such as VAR. So, what is the GVAR representation? What is the GVAR? GVAR it's only a global vector regression. Okay, it's a VAR, a usual VAR that you have but with some weak exogenous variables. Known as here in this equation as with X star, with this matrix delta that takes the trade here in this paper, the trade weighted linked with those countries. So it's a VAR that deal with some particularities with this kind of loss of degree freedom from the VAR methodology. These weak exogenous variables are made from these omega and formed by weight trade flows or any other economic variables that represent the bilateral connection between the countries. This bilateral linkage omega is exogenous and fixed. And also this X star is function of X. So here, what you have in this equation is a VAR for each of the countries that you analyze, plus these weak exogenous variables representing the external variables from the domestic country that we are analyzing. Here is the representation of the VAR that you pass ahead. It's very similar from the VAR and follow the same properties of the VAR methodology, even in terms of stability and also in the relationship between the entities or the countries that we are analyzing here. You also use Bayesian estimation in our estimation. We use the stochastic search variable selection. You follow this SSVS prior because it takes into consideration the uncertainty about the variable choice. In the GVAR estimation, it allows that you can use different VARs specification for each country. So when you use this kind of prior, it gives us information if that variable that we are using in a certain country is important or not. It applies shrinking on the parameters of the model as well. It's a kind of point that has been used in this estimation strategy. Another assumptions that I made in the estimation process is that I assume a stochastic volatility for the variance covariance. The hyperparameters values in distribution choice follow closest for the Kisher. That one that has presented this choice prior for the GVAR model. And also I have considered 16,000 draws and 30,000 burn-ins for the model. And in the final, I have also used a design distribution approach as a structure identification. In this kind of identification, it's interesting. It's important here because we can take some ideas from how the variables will react after some shocks that you are applying in the model. So, for example, when you have a domestic exchange rate depreciation, we think that the consumer price will not increase. Also, in the domestic exchange rate depreciation, the risk premium you follow this movement and probably will increase as well. But for example, in the interest rate, you are not sure about what will be the movement. Not in terms that in terms of the interest rate if you rise or not, but more if this rise will be contemporaneous or not. If this exchange rate depreciation will happen in the interest rate, you move it in the contemporaneously, or you take one quarter to go on. So this kind of sign restriction approach it allows us to deal with this kind of scheme. In the data sample, we use quarterly data from 2002 to 2019 from Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. And also, you added 4 big economies, China, Eurozone, Japan, and the USA, to mimic better the real trade flows. Otherwise, it will set much higher weight for the commerce between the Latin countries. So if you have, for example, a commerce between Mexico and another Latin Americas, and I don't insert the USA, is that sum should be 1. They put much more weight for the other Latin American economies. So in China, Eurozone, Japan, and the USA, I can control better for this kind of thing. Also, because I can use some source, some economic shock source from outside Latin America as well. So here I have the VAR specification for each Latin American country. So I have the GDP, the domestic price, the nominal exchange rate, the sovereign risk spread, the AMB, and the interest rate. And for the 4 big economies, I put it differently. For example, for the USA, I inserted the commodities prices here, since they are considered endogenous in the USA and also in China, because they are big enough to affect the prices of the commodities. And also I inserted the VIX here as a measure of volatility and to put as a uncertainty shock in our results. So the dynamics of each Latin America country can be represented by this equation. This is an equation with endogenous variables here for each of the Latin American countries, plus some weak exogenous countries, or it is the foreign variables of each of Latin American countries. It's important to note that this X star it includes not only the 4 big economies variables, but also from another Latin American countries as well. Here's the weak exogenous variables that should be sum 1. That's why I put the 4 big economies here you can see better, because you shoot someone, if you don't put those four big economies, the someone will put much more higher trade for another Latin Americans, generating great impact if they have, and this assumption consider a culture shock may not have a great impact on other countries unless they have a relevant commerce between them. So we will not think that, for example, a shock that comes from the USA should impact Mexico, should be relevant for Mexico, for example, and for all the Latin Americas, not only Mexico. So the identification will follow what Hullig's idea. If you know implicit, it was otherwise not. And you use three kinds of shocks, three sources of shock. A domestic shock for each individual Latin American country. So you use like a domestic demand shock, an exchange rate shock, a monetary policy shock, a commodity shock, and a risk premium shock. A regional shock, a shock that hits all Latin American countries at the same time, and a global shock that is an economic shock that spreads for the whole world. Here is a table that I use. I present how I have identified the shocks that the identification. So, for example, the demand shock, I inserted here that you have increase in output and also in the CPI. When you have this star here, is that it is unrestricted. Is zero is that the interest rate here you not reacts at the same time when they see the demand shock. We have these five shocks here. There we have these four shocks, not five. It's for each Latin American countries. But when you have this dash line here, below this dash line here, you have some shocks that comes from abroad. So you have, for example, a risk premium shock. That is the shock that I said that hits all the Latin American countries at the same time. So, for example, you have a risk premium that is increasing, the risk premium at the same time the CPI, and also the domestic variables, the domestic variables. So you have the same for the interest rate, but for the VIX and the oil price shock, I put an oil price shock and demand shock because sometimes it's difficult to identify what is demand shock or what is price demand shock. So I didn't put anything in the Latin American countries because in the VAR estimation, I didn't insert commodities in the Latin American countries because it's not endogenous to those countries. So I just shock these variables outside and see what happens with the IRF. So the impulse response functions, I will highlight these impulse response functions. But first of all, I want to like to see that the RPT is assuming the ratio of inflation response in all periods after the exchange rate movement in time zero. Actually, in the reality, when you are in the literature, when you analyze the exchange rate pass through, they fix the parameters and make a kind of analysis of ceteris paribus analysis, like, oh, what happens in the inflation rate after exchange rate shock, putting on all parameters fixed. But here in a VAR, in this kind of VAR, in GVAR, all parameters are dynamic. So I know that it's a kind of strong assumption to make this kind, but in this kind of literature that are analyzing the source of shock, the importance, the relevance of the source of the shock for the exchange rate pass through, they set the magnitude of the exchange rate pass through as the inflation response in all periods after exchange rate movement in time zero. So here I have the REF for the 5 Latin American countries. But what you see here, for example, for the exchange rate shock, is that we see an increase in the inflation rate. At the same time, we can see the shock, and the MB are rising at the same time. And the interest rate following this inflation rising, increase, it rise as well. You can see this in all of the countries here. And we can calculate it. In the paper, I have like all of the REFs, but because of the time here, I will show only this one. But in the paper, we have a table. We have all the REF, but we have a table here that it calculates this magnitude of the exchange rate pass through from all the shocks that we made. You can see here for all the countries like Brazil, Chile, Colombia, but also Peru and Mexico. The demand shock is the shock that it makes the exchange, it gives us the higher magnitude of the exchange rate pass through. And also it's interesting to see that from the risk premium shock, from regional or local shocks, there is no change, bigger change in Brazil, but for Chile, it has a big difference. From domestic shocks, we see that risk premium has bigger exchange rate pass through, a magnitude from the exchange rate, okay? And another interesting result is about the commodity shocks, demand shock, that comes from abroad. We see that we don't have an exchange rate, a relevant exchange rate. It seems that here that as those economies are commodity exporter, probably they have a negative correlation between domestic currency and the commodity prices. So what you see here in the commodities shock is that we don't have or we have a negative exchange rate shock, exchange rate pass through. So here I made some robustness analysis. What I do here is to allow the interest rate to respond contemporaneously to the shocks. The results remains about the same. The conclusion overall, but in overall they don't bring too much difference. So as my conclusion, the inflation rate responsive rise according to the shock applied. The reaction of other variables plays an important role in determining the magnitude of the exchange rate pass through. GDP, the interest rate, sovereign risk premium, and others shows that the source of the shock brings information about the magnitude of the inflation rate response and introduce a new way to investigate the exchange rate pass through.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's been very interesting reading this paper. I like it a lot. And also, the presentation was also clarifying. So, okay, so I'm not a specialist on this. I'm sort of an end consumer and enthusiastic reader. So I had a lot of fun reading it. So my comments may be a little bit basic, but hopefully they are useful. Okay, so I mean the definition of exchange rate pass-through is basically I just put it there for convenience, or at least what I have in mind should be the exchange rate pass-through, and it's the degree of the exchange rate changes that translates into domestic prices, basically, right? So there are questions about the size of this pass-through and the transmission channels about this pass-through. And in open economies, more questions appear, basically, when you have basically connection between many open economies and how, I mean, it appears this question that they study in this paper, how important are the linkages between economies, wherever they matters, and how important are spillovers effect, and so on. And there are a couple of questions that I leave for the end. The key question that they want to analyze is whether different shocks are going to have different pass-through, and which type of shock is the most important one in accounting for that, in a sense. So, I mean, the first thing I understood with this paper is that they have to congratulate the authors, because they are after good questions, key questions in theory and applied macro. And they are doing a nice strategy to tackle them. Their strategy is basically following a Bayesian global bar methodology, including 5 countries: Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, and that are kind of the and study 4 shocks and try to understand and to measure the pass-through after each shock and try to compare them. No? So a couple of comments, because I'm also coming from the literature on New Keynesian and New Keynesian open economies and so on. So a couple of comments that I found from the first read I did to this paper. I mean, I think there's a very natural definition of output gap that you're using in the paper, and it would be the difference between the observed output data and the HP trend. I think that's the output gap that you have there. Yeah, okay. I had my mind in the previous paper that I read in the Keynesian paper, and then I got a little bit confused. But nothing to do with that compare that economy with a flexible price economy or something like that. The second thing is something that I think it can be a little bit more kind of neat, but there may be a good reason to do what you did. So in the paper, I think that they measure CPI, the nominal exchange rate, and spreads in log differences, and the policy rate is annualized levels. I, in principle, would treat them in the same way, but there may be a reason for that. So, and I don't think that it will really change anything, but just, I mean, if you have a talk like me, this sometimes helps. And also, I assume also that the interest rate is a domestic interest rate, policy related. These are all countries that, to some extent, have been trying to follow Taylor or inflation targeting rules. So I think that that's the type of instrument that you include. Of course, this is a BAR paper with a BAR. I will pick on the identification. That's what I have to do. Okay, so there were 2 things in the identification that caught my attention, and now after the presentation, now there are 3. So the first one is that the core of the paper is to measure the exchange rate pass-through and this connection between CPI and exchange rate. Given that here we are using sign restrictions, I would leave the response of CPI to exchange rate shocks open, even if it is very very clear that it should be a positive response. I would try to put less structure on that. And I know that leave that unrestricted, because when you do the input responses, also that input response in all the cases, the CPI response to an exchange rate shock is positive and significant for 2 periods, which is the identification assumption. It's not significant for longer periods in many cases. So probably that assumption puts a lot of structure, and even though that's not the main point of the paper, that structure may kind of have spillover on the pass-through per se, right? So probably leaving that open may kind of be a nice robustness exercise. The second thing that caught my attention of the identification are the assumed no response of output gap to all these shocks. But given that, on impact, no? But given that the data is quarterly, within a quarter probably output, still, I mean, annually I will tell you no. Annually, yes.
For example, for the interest rate, I put it like you will not respond at the same time, but in the robust analysis, I let it respond
Okay.
at the same time.
Okay.
But I can do it for the output gap as well. There is no problem.
Yeah, no, that was, I was thinking, I mean, within a quarter, probably there's some action that...
There's a discussion. So you respond at the same quarter or not?
Exactly. Yeah. And okay, and the last thing that got in the presentation got my attention is that you are living. I mean, this is I don't know. I'm just guessing. You are leaving unrestricted all these responses.
Yeah.
Is it possible to put more structure here because you're not super interested in learning from this and putting less structure here? That you are really.
No, it's difficult because more of restriction makes the model put less uncertainty in the model, but sometimes it can't estimate.
Yeah, because of the rotation
Of
of
course,
stuff.
the rotation
But what I
metrics,
mean is,
yeah.
put more structure here and less here.
Yeah.
So, because you care more about this block, I think. So that's something. I mean, probably
No,
that's
yeah,
something
yeah.
that can be tried.
You can like take this table and I try this and I try that.
Yeah, and there's many.
No, it's easy and it's not so difficult.
Okay, and okay. So let me see. Okay, this is all I just said. Okay, and the very last thing, the paper starts saying we are going to estimate the global bar because the linkages matter. Would be nice to see how much. Is it possible to do it in a simple way? Kill in the same model, kill the linkages and re-estimate it?
In the estimation of VARs, we have like two stages. The first one, we estimate VARs individually for each country. And then the second stage, we use the linkages and link all the countries. So, for example, for VAR for Brazil, for Chile, are estimated separately, each one in its space. Then they sum to include it in the global VAR.
Okay.
But I think it's not impossible.
Okay.
I have to think about it.
I mean, it would be nice to see actually how important are these spillovers for the
I know that the
pass-through.
GVAR, it's important, it's interesting because the GVAR, it allows to use that matrix omega that use the trade links, the spillover effects by financial effects, or by not just weighted trade, but financial, some kind of financial, weighted financial trade, weighted with financial, something like that.
And then there's, I mean, I know this very nice paper by Javier Garcia-Sico and Mariana Garcia-Schmidt that they design a DSG model to study pass-through. This is, I mean, it's a whole different strategy, but there's, from that paper, I know that there are also some nice things that probably with different models you can address for future research. I mean, probably the role of expectations and policy regimes are hard to get in a reduced form on this BIR model, but study asymmetry in the transmission channel. That can also be interesting because you are studying asymmetry of the exchange rate pass-through after different shocks, but doing it after different kind of assuming asymmetry in the transmission channel, kind of how the pass-through operates in a recession and expansion and so on. That can also be something nice to speak with the global bar. I mean, with okay. So those are my comments. Again, congratulations. I like the paper a lot.
Do you want to add another reply? Anything else?
No, I think it's okay.
Well, just for the sake of time, I invite you to read all the 3 papers and convey the last batch of questions to João during the lunch. I invite you to lunch and resume at 20 past 1. Thank you very much.